When racist cops stopped Big Shaq's mother on a quiet morning street, they thought they saw just another suspect. But what they really faced was the calm power of a legacy too strong to be profiled. Lucille O'Neal didn't need to raise her voice. The world did that for her, because once they realized who she raised, the silence turned to shame, and a name they thought meant nothing rewrote the whole narrative. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. It was the kind of morning that made even the sidewalks seem soft. Sunlight fell in golden slants across the front yards and porches of a quiet Georgia town, the kind where neighbors still nodded and waved, where lawn chairs creaked from recent use, and coffee brewed behind screen doors that hadn't been replaced in decades. The air carried a warmth that wrapped around the skin like a familiar shawl, not too hot, not yet heavy. It was the kind of morning Lucille O'Neal had known all her life, familiar, steady, predictable, or so it seemed. She stepped out with a canvas tote over her arm, dressed in a crisp white blouse and slacks, the kind of outfit that said she still took pride in the little things. Her silver curls were neatly brushed back, her posture upright with the quiet dignity that only years of holding a family together could sculpt. Her gait was steady, slow but assured. She was just heading to the post office, 4 blocks down, a left at the pharmacy, a right past the little hardware shop. With the faded signage, she'd walked it hundreds of times, but this time something was different. It started with the low murmur of an engine, not unusual in itself. Cars passed through all the time, but this one didn't pass. It hovered. She didn't turn, didn't need to. A second vehicle joined it, the echo of another cruiser just a half block behind the first. The street was nearly empty, save for an elderly couple raking leaves across the way, and a dog that had long given up barking at anything that moved. The sound of those 2 patrol cars together in that silent street began to stretch the space, making it feel tighter somehow. Lucille felt it, not the fear she'd grown past fear years ago. No, what she felt was older, deeper. A knowing. The kind of knowing that lives in black skin like muscle memory. The awareness of being watched, followed, measured. She kept walking. 2 more blocks. The rhythm of her steps, once easy, now slightly more deliberate. She glanced at the sidewalk, at the cracks she'd memorized. She didn't need to look back. She could feel their eyes in the back of her neck like an itch you can't scratch. Still she said nothing. Did nothing, because she'd done nothing wrong. A sharp chirp of a siren broke the calm. Just one short burst, the kind meant more as a warning than a command. Lucille stopped. She turned, slow, composed, as if offering a silent invitation. 2 uniformed officers stepped out. One was young, tall, stiff, with a jaw clenched so tight, it looked carved from stone. His nameplate read Granger. The other was older, heavier, with thinning hair and a mustache that twitched every time he blinked. That was Sergeant Kellerman. He didn't say much at first, just stood with arms crossed, watching. "Ma'am," Officer Granger began. His voice clipped. "Can we talk for a moment?" Lucille blinked once. Her face was unreadable. "About what, officer?" she asked. "You match the description of someone we're looking for," he said. Lucille raised an eyebrow, not with surprise, with familiarity. "And what description might that be?" she asked steady. Granger hesitated. He wasn't expecting resistance wrapped in such poise. "Elderly black female, light clothing, carrying a bag," he replied, glancing toward her tote like it might explode. Lucille didn't move, didn't offer the bag, didn't fidget. That could describe half the women in this neighborhood. She said. Kellerman stepped forward now, slower, more cautious. "It's routine," he said. "We've had reports." She nodded slowly. "I'm sure you have." Granger's eyes flicked toward the cruiser. "Do you have ID on you?" Lucille reached into her tote, without rush or fear. She produced a leather wallet, and held out her license. Granger took it, and walked it back to the patrol car, leaving her standing in the sunlight, the morning now stripped of its peace. Kellerman didn't speak again, just stood with a strange look, part concern, part discomfort, like he knew this shouldn't be happening, but also knew better than to stop it. The breeze picked up slightly, rustling the oak leaves in soft whispering circles. Lucille didn't speak. She didn't ask why. She knew the answer. It was never about her. Not really. It was about what she looked like in this town, on this street, with that bag. Inside the cruiser, Granger was typing furiously, lips tight, frustration growing. He wasn't finding what he wanted. Lucille O'Neal, clean record, no outstanding warrants, no alerts, just an address, an age, a quiet history. But something was bothering him. Something about that name. He opened another tab, searched it. That's when the silence in the car shifted. He looked again at the ID, then at the screen, then at her, standing in the middle of the sidewalk, with the poise of someone who had once stood before tens of thousands of fans and taught a young giant how to walk, how to believe, how to ride. Outside, Lucille waited. She could hear nothing, but she didn't need to. She knew that moment, the shift when suspicion begins to backpedal into discomfort. When the realization hits that the person they stopped was not just someone, she was someone. Granger stepped back out. Slower this time. His tone tried to reshape itself. "Ms. O'Neal," he said. "We appreciate your cooperation." Lucille looked at him, her eyes neither angry nor warm. "Just steady. Am I free to go?" Granger nodded, almost imperceptibly. "Yes, ma'am." She turned, walked away, each step measured. The tote swung gently at her side. Behind her, the silence had thickened, not with threat, but with shame. The sun was still shining, but it didn't feel the same. A neighborhood watched without watching. Blinds shifted. Curtains moved. Everyone had seen something, even if no one said anything. That's how these things worked, not in the loudness of sirens, but in the quiet echo of what should never have happened in the first place. Lucille didn't need to tell anyone. She didn't need to call her son. The world would do that part for her soon enough. But in that moment, all she did was walk. And with each step she left behind something far heavier than a tote bag. She left behind the assumption that silence would always be the safest choice. Lucille hadn't made it more than half a block from where the cruiser first pulled away before she felt the presence again. Not imagined, not coincidental. It was deliberate, measured. The low hum of the engine returned, this time following from behind at a crawling pace. The rhythm of her walking shoes against the concrete slowed, not from fear but from a calculated calm. She turned her head slightly, just enough to catch the reflection of the same black and white vehicle in a storefront window. Not gone, just circling. It wasn't over. This time, the car pulled directly ahead of her and stopped at an angle, cutting the sidewalk like a gate, without a fence. Officer Granger stepped out alone, his partner Sergeant Kellerman, lingering inside, barely visible through the windshield. Granger's stance was rigid, shoulders squared in that performative posture trained in academies that taught more about control than compassion. He didn't announce himself, he just looked at her, like the badge on his chest entitled him to answers before he asked the question. Lucille didn't flinch. Her eyes met his evenly, her breath steady. Still, the unease in the air thickened. "Ma'am," he said again, his tone a hair more assertive than before. "Can I speak with you further?" Lucille stood silent for a moment, as if calculating the cost of saying no. Finally, she nodded once. "You already are." He motioned toward her bag again. "Can I see what you're carrying today?" She held it tighter. "Are you accusing me of something, officer?" "You're not under arrest," he replied quickly, too quickly like the line had been rehearsed. "But you do match the description of a person of interest." Lucille's voice was still low, but firmer now. "You said that already. When does the story change?" Granger's jaw tightened. He looked toward the car, but Kellerman didn't move. The older man's eyes were trained on them, but his hands stayed on the steering wheel, watching, detached. Lucille turned slightly, just enough to angle her body away from the curb. Not to flee, she never would, but to shift the balance of power. Granger stepped in closer. "I need you to answer where you're going and why." Lucille narrowed her eyes. "I'm going to the post office, mailing a birthday card. My granddaughter turned 9 today." He didn't ask to see the card, though his eyes drifted to the bag again. The silence between them pressed down like humidity. Somewhere down the street, a delivery truck beeped as it backed into a driveway. But here, on this corner, it felt like the world had stopped to witness something it wasn't supposed to. She extended her ID once more. Slower this time. Granger hesitated to take it. Like touching it meant accepting something more than just a name. Finally, he reached for it. "Thank you," he muttered. Lucille said nothing. This time, Kellerman stepped out of the vehicle, his movement slower, older bones resisting urgency. He stood by the car, hands on his hips, and said nothing as Granger disappeared into the cruiser to run the ID again. Kellerman didn't speak to Lucille, but his eyes carried more story than words could. There was a flicker of recognition there, not necessarily of her name, but of the moment, of history repeating itself. of a woman being made to explain herself, for daring to exist freely in public. "You know this isn't right," Lucille said to him, her voice low but deliberate. Kellerman shifted uncomfortably, scratched the side of his neck. "It's procedure," he replied, after a pause, not looking at her. "Whose?" she asked. "Yours or his?" He didn't answer. Inside the car, Granger stared at the monitor with a deepening scowl. Lucille O'Neal, born 1955. No criminal history, no traffic violations, no red flags, nothing to support what he wanted to see. The only thing drawing him deeper was her name. Something tugged at the edge of his mind, a recognition he hadn't quite placed. He clicked into a browser window and typed it in, Lucille O'Neal. The results came fast, faster than he was ready for. Books, foundation work, speeches, pictures, standing next to one of the most recognizable athletes in the world. A man larger than life in every way. Granger stared at a photo of her on stage, elegant and composed, introducing her son to a roaring crowd. Her son, Shaquille O'Neal. Granger's throat tightened. Outside, Lucille stood as still as a statue, her eyes locked, not on the car, but on the slow-moving clouds above. She looked tired now, not physically, but soul-tired. The kind that doesn't come from the weight of one encounter, but from a lifetime of them. She'd been measured, interrogated, diminished more times than anyone could count, and she had survived them all. But it didn't mean it got easier. It didn't mean she felt less of the sting. Granger emerged again, but his walk had changed. No longer full of sharp energy, it had slowed, as though he were approaching something fragile or radioactive. "Ms. O'Neal," he began, avoiding her gaze. "You're free to go." Lucille tilted her head slightly. "I was never not free." He looked like he wanted to respond, but couldn't. Kellerman stepped forward now, his tone more measured. "We apologize for the inconvenience, ma'am." Lucille exhaled through her nose. Not a sigh, a relief. "I'll be going now," she said. She turned, and this time no one stopped her. She walked away, each footstep echoing louder in their ears than any siren could. Behind her, Granger stood in the middle of the street, silent, his posture slackened. Kellerman climbed back into the car, but before he shut the door he looked at Granger and said, "You ever ask yourself why you needed to stop her in the first place?" Granger didn't reply, and Lucille, without another glance, disappeared around the corner. Not running, not hiding, just walking tall through a world that still hadn't learned how to see her properly, unless someone else's fame forced their eyes open. But the stare that lingered behind her wasn't just his. It was America's, and it had been watching her for a long, long time. The door shut with a thud that was louder than it needed to be. Not aggressive, but final. The kind of sound that signaled a line had been drawn, even if no words declared it. Lucille sat in the back of the squad car, her tote bag now placed beside her like a quiet witness. The divider between her and the front seat felt more like a wall than a window. Though she could see the tops of their heads, Officer Granger hunched over the computer screen again, and Sergeant Kellerman, watching from the driver's side mirror, his eyes more curious than concerned. The vinyl seat was warm from the sun, but it held the coldness of memory. She'd been here before, not in this exact car, not in this exact town, but in this same position, seen through a lens that turned her presence into a problem. Her eyes drifted to the window, and suddenly the street outside blurred into the brick walls of a Newark apartment complex. It was the early. Lucille was younger then, her arms full of groceries she couldn't quite afford. Shaquille walking beside her, lanky and already tall for his age, asking questions about the world he didn't understand yet. Back then she'd had to teach him which corners to avoid, how to keep his voice low around police officers, how to shrink his size when he walked into a store so no one would feel threatened. Even then, the world had already decided he would be too big, too loud, too black to be innocent. She remembered one winter night when she was stopped walking home from work. No badge, no reason, just suspicion, just eyes that didn't like the way she moved through space, as if she belonged. They asked where she was going. She said home. That wasn't enough. They searched her bag, then her coat pockets, found nothing but receipts and aspirin, told her to watch herself. She didn't cry. She never did in front of them. Back in the car, Granger tapped at the keyboard, frustrated again, as if the information on the screen wasn't matching the narrative he'd already built in his mind. Lucille's ID was clean. So was her posture. So was her face. Composed, unwavering. But he was looking for something else. Something beneath the surface that he could justify, and he wasn't finding it. Lucille blinked slowly and leaned back against the seat. Her thoughts wandered again, this time to the sound of Shaquille's laughter echoing off the walls of their two-bedroom apartment, his sneakers thudding against worn hardwood as he chased a rolled-up sock pretending to be a basketball. She remembered patching holes in his jeans with mismatched thread, working night shifts just to make sure he could have his own pillow. She remembered filling out free lunch forms and telling him to keep his head high even when other kids whispered behind him. She remembered the way people used to look at her when she walked into school offices. The hesitation, the polite mistrust, the way they'd ask, "Are you his mother?" with a tone that always held surprise, as if someone like her couldn't raise someone like him. And when Shaquille got his first scholarship offer, she cried, not for joy but for relief. Relief that maybe, just maybe, the world would have to start seeing him the way she always had, brilliant, kind, full of purpose. Not just a body, not just a threat. The silence in the squad car was thick now. Kellerman shifted in his seat. The radio buzzed quietly, but no one answered it. Granger glanced over his shoulder, their eyes meeting through the glass. He looked away first. Lucille's memories kept moving. She thought of the first time she saw Shaquille on TV, towering over other players, dominating the court like he was built from something otherworldly. But all she saw was her baby, the one who used to curl up next to her on the couch and ask if superheroes were real. She never told him he already was one. Even when he became famous, she knew there were rooms he'd enter, where none of that would matter, where the old gaze, the one that doubted, questioned, suspected, would return, no matter how many titles he earned. Fame didn't erase blackness. It just complicated how the world processed it. Lucille sat straighter. Her fingers tapped once on the plastic seat beneath her, a nervous rhythm she didn't even realize she was making. She wasn't afraid. She was exhausted, not just from this day but from decades of proving, of protecting, of pressing forward. She looked again at the back of Granger's head and thought, he doesn't know the half of it. He didn't know about the time she marched in silent protest when she was 17, or how she'd been denied a job she was qualified for because her voice wasn't professional enough. He didn't know how many doors she knocked on for community housing, how many nights she prayed over food stamps. He didn't know the strength it took to raise a child who would be judged by his body before his heart. He didn't know what it meant to survive, then thrive, then be pulled back into a cage, even temporarily, by someone too young to remember what it cost her to build the life she had. And yet, here they were. Again. Granger finally opened the door and offered her back the ID without looking her in the eye. "You're good to go," he muttered. Lucille took it slowly, deliberately. No thanks, no words. As she stepped out of the car, her feet landed on the pavement, with a weight that wasn't visible, but it was there. It always had been. She adjusted her bag on her shoulder, straightened her blouse, and walked on. The echoes of her past didn't fade. They marched beside her, quiet but unrelenting, reminding her that this wasn't just about today. It never was. They entered the intake room, small, windowless, lined with whiteboards and schedules that nobody seemed to follow. Granger slid the ID across the desk to the on-duty tech, a disinterested man named Foster who wore his headset slightly tilted and sipped lukewarm coffee from a styrofoam cup that had lipstick smudged on the rim, though no one had seen a woman near him in hours. "Run that again," Granger said. Foster raised an eyebrow. "Didn't you already check this?" "Do it again," Granger snapped, then caught himself. "Please." Foster shrugged and typed the name into the system without urgency. A few moments passed, filled only by the gentle tapping of keys. Granger crossed the room and leaned against the filing cabinet, eyes on nothing in particular. He didn't like how this felt. Something wasn't adding up. He wasn't sure what it was, but his gut, the same gut he usually trusted, was twisting. Lucille O'Neal. He repeated it in his mind. Why did it sound so damn familiar? Foster's typing slowed. His brow furrowed. Granger noticed. "What is it?" Foster didn't answer right away. He leaned in toward the screen, scrolled down, paused, then leaned back and blinked. "Lucille O'Neal," he said slowly, dragging the syllables. "Huh. What?" Granger's voice was tighter now. Foster glanced up. "You run facial ID on her?" "No," Granger replied, defensive. "She gave her license. She wasn't a suspect, just matched a description." Kellerman snorted faintly from the corner. Foster turned the monitor slightly. Granger stepped forward and read what was on the screen. The usual DMV data was there. Then an appended tag, public figure match detected, linked media results available. Granger clicked. A new tab opened. Photos loaded. High-res full-color images. Lucille O'Neal. Standing next to celebrities. Behind podiums. In front of schools. Holding honorary plaques. Pictured with her son towering beside her. Smiling. Unmistakable. Granger's stomach sank. Shaquille O'Neal. He stepped back from the screen as if it had struck him. "No way," he muttered. Kellerman approached slowly now. Arms uncrossed. He looked over Granger's shoulder. "Told you her name sounded familiar." Granger said nothing. His brain was racing. He pulled out his phone, opened Google, and typed the name. The search returned in under a second. Top result: Lucille O'Neal, mother of NBA Hall of Famer Shaquille O'Neal. Author, speaker, philanthropist. The air in the room shifted. Foster leaned back in his chair and gave a low whistle. "You stopped that, Lucille O'Neal." Granger's mouth went dry. His pride started writhing in the back of his throat, trying to reassert itself. "How was I supposed to know?" "She didn't say anything." "She didn't have to," Kellerman muttered. "He didn't ask." Granger shot him a glare, but Kellerman didn't back down. The room went quiet, and in that silence, the full scope of the moment took hold. Granger turned away, paced once, then twice, then stopped. "She was calm. Too calm," he said aloud, as if looking for justification. "Didn't even flinch when I asked about the bag. She's probably had to do that her whole life." Kellerman replied, "You think being famous makes her immune to this?" Granger wasn't listening anymore. He was already opening the body cam footage on his tablet. He needed to see it for himself. Maybe the camera had captured something he missed, something that would absolve him, or at least explain the discomfort now rising in his chest like a slow burn. He watched the playback silently. Lucille's composure, her tone, the way she neither resisted nor complied with fear. She stood with a grace that mocked the suspicion aimed at her. And still he saw it in his own face. The look, the presumption, the power he carried like a weapon without a holster. Someone else walked into the room, a young female dispatcher who glanced at the screen and paused mid-step. "Wait, is that—" she began. "Yeah," Foster said without looking up. "That's her." The dispatcher's voice dropped. "Lucille O'Neal. She gave a keynote at my sister's graduation." Whole crowd cried. "She's incredible." Granger rubbed his temple. "She didn't tell us who she was. Didn't say a word." "Would you have treated her differently if she had?" the dispatcher asked. Her voice cool. Granger didn't respond. Kellerman finally turned toward the door. "She left 10 minutes ago, by the way. On foot. You let her walk back alone." "She refused a ride," Granger said, more to himself. The silence returned, this time heavier. Even Foster stopped typing. "Go check the parking lot cameras," Kellerman said. "You'll probably find a crowd by now. That woman's name carries weight." And it did. Across town, outside the post office, whispers were already forming. Someone had recognized her as she stepped through the front doors. A clerk paused mid-scan. A young man in line tapped his phone and looked up with wide eyes. By the time Lucille exited with her receipt folded neatly in her tote, a bystander had already posted a blurry photo on social media, with the caption, "Lucille O'Neal stopped by police for matching a description." Seriously, it hadn't gone viral yet, but it was beginning. The slow simmer of a story that would soon boil. Back at the station, Granger sat down heavily in the nearest chair. He hadn't processed it all yet. He only knew that something irreversible had happened. Not just the realization of who she was, but the deeper truth of what she'd been put through. What he had become, even for just those few minutes. The uniform hadn't shielded him from it. It had exposed him. No apology would come easy now. Not from him. Not from a man who built certainty into his badge, and found out he was only half looking. Across the room, Kellerman leaned against the doorframe and said quietly, "Sometimes the silence says more than any name ever could." Granger didn't reply. He was too busy reading the screen again. Lucille O'Neal. And in his mind the name no longer echoed confusion. It rang with weight, and the sound of a mistake that couldn't be erased. Officer Granger stood near the admin desk, arms stiff at his sides, jaw clenched, staring blankly at a bulletin board, covered in old flyers and outdated community notices. He wasn't seeing anything on it. His mind was spiraling. Sergeant Kellerman approached without a word, paused beside him, and waited a beat before speaking. His voice was quiet, but there was something sharp underneath. "You do know who she is, right?" Granger didn't answer immediately. He didn't need to. His face said enough. The recognition had landed, not with awe but with shame. He nodded slightly, eyes still fixed on the board. "Yeah, I figured it out." Kellerman scoffed under his breath, not with humor, but disappointment. "Took you long enough." Granger turned to face him. "She didn't say anything." "She didn't have to," Kellerman replied. "You had her name. You had her ID. You had every chance to stop that before it got where it did." The younger officer looked away again, biting down hard on a retort he couldn't justify. He knew the mistake wasn't in the data. It was in the instinct, in the assumption, the automatic suspicion that had filled the space where logic should have lived. In the background, two other officers stood near the printer, pretending to be busy, but clearly eavesdropping. One of them whispered something under his breath, and the other's eyes widened. Within minutes, the news had started to ripple outward, a quiet chain reaction of surprise, disbelief, and hushed conversations that grew louder as the truth sunk deeper into the walls. "Lucille O'Neal?" someone muttered down the hall. "Like, his mother?" The confirmation came not with certainty, but with a series of cautious nods and glances toward the front entrance, as if half expecting Shaq himself to come barreling through the doors in protest. But he didn't. He didn't have to. The embarrassment was already blooming, creeping up the backs of their necks and settling in the pit of their stomachs like sour milk. Granger walked into the break room and found two detectives huddled around a laptop. They didn't notice him at first, too focused on the video already circulating online. Someone had uploaded a shaky phone recording from across the street, Lucille walking away from the cruiser, toad in hand, head held high, with the caption, "They didn't know who she was. She didn't have to tell them." Granger stared at the screen, jaw tightening further. The camera didn't capture him directly, but it didn't have to. The story was already being told. And worse than being seen was being known. For the wrong thing, at the wrong time. He backed out of the room and nearly collided with Foster, who raised both hands in mock surrender. "Hey, don't shoot the messenger, man. I didn't tweet it." Granger glared at him, but it was hollow. He didn't have the energy to defend himself anymore. Not here. Not now. Not when every whisper sounded like judgment, and every glance felt like a mirror he didn't want to face. Lucille, meanwhile, had returned to the station's public lobby. She sat quietly on the bench by the front windows, legs crossed at the ankle, flipping through her receipt like it held more meaning than the noise gathering around her. She'd been told someone would bring her a written apology, a formal misunderstanding notice for internal records. She said she'd wait. She sat there for 17 minutes. And in those 17 minutes, not one officer approached her. They passed by. Yes, quick steps, clipped nods, stolen glances, but no one offered her a word. She didn't ask for any. She wasn't there for a show. She wasn't angry, not outwardly. That made it worse. She radiated a calm that unsettled them more than shouting ever could. Because her silence wasn't passive. It was heavy. It was earned. Back inside, Kellerman returned to the intake desk and stood beside Granger, who now sat slumped in a swivel chair, elbows on knees. The screen beside them still displayed her profile, along with half a dozen open tabs filled with articles, interviews, foundation work and press clippings. Her impact was undeniable, not just as a mother of a superstar, but as a figure in her own right, a woman who had built herself from broken pieces, and then held those pieces up as a mirror to the world. Granger shook his head. "What do I do now?" Kellerman didn't answer immediately. He looked down at the tablet in his hand, the video still frozen on the image of Lucille walking away. Then he said, "Depends what kind of man you want to be." Granger looked up at him. "You think I should go out there? Say something?" Kellerman shrugged. "You should have done that 30 minutes ago. But now, I don't think it's about what you say. I think it's about what you're willing to learn." Granger didn't move. He didn't get up, didn't rush out into the lobby. Something in him still resisted, not because he didn't see the mistake, but because swallowing it whole meant letting go of the authority that gave him comfort. His pride clung like a shadow, stubborn and unresolved. Lucille stood up on her own. She folded the receipt, placed it back into her bag, and walked out the front doors of the station, with the same quiet dignity she had walked in with. No apology had been spoken, no words exchanged, but her presence had done the work. And inside, the whispers didn't stop. They deepened. All the whispers, the looks, the clicks of keyboards behind half-closed doors. He finally tapped the number. His voice when he spoke was flat but strained. "Lieutenant Evans." "Yeah. We need to talk." The voice on the other end didn't respond immediately. Granger gave a rundown. Sanitized, clipped, careful not to sound panicked, but layered with enough weight to suggest this situation was becoming something far bigger than it had started. He mentioned her name, and when he did, Evans stopped him mid-sentence. "Lucille O'Neal? Like Shaquille O'Neal's mother?" Granger confirmed. The next sound he heard was a breath being held, then released sharply. "Don't move. I'm making a call."
The line went dead.
Granger stared at the phone for a moment, then slipped it back into his pocket. There was no way to walk this back, and he knew it. He paced, stiff and robotic, the soles of his shoes squeaking faintly on the waxed tile floor. Sergeant Kellerman leaned in the doorway nearby, arms crossed, watching without speaking. He didn't need to. The storm was brewing on its own. In a government building across town, that call jumped desks, from Lieutenant Evans to Deputy Chief Maris, and then again to the city commissioner's office. No one wanted to be the last to know. No one wanted to be caught on the wrong side of it. Not with a name like O'Neal tied to the story. Not when the narrative was already forming online, curated by pixels and public perception, far faster than any official memo could catch. At the precinct, 20 minutes later, a shift occurred, not in the atmosphere, but in the posture of the people. The front desk clerk was suddenly attentive. The officers who had passed Lucille without a word were now hesitant, almost awkward in their steps. The air carried a faint tension, like a building waiting for a power surge. Lieutenant Evans arrived through the front door, coat half buttoned, phone still in hand. He didn't greet anyone. He walked straight into the main corridor, and pulled Granger aside with a glance sharp enough to slice through the wall of shame already thick in the room.
"What the hell happened?" Evans asked.
Granger tried to explain. Matched a description. Standard protocol. She didn't identify herself, but his voice faltered under Evans' stare. It wasn't the explanation that mattered now. It was the outcome. And the outcome was spiraling. Evans's voice was low, almost a whisper, but each word struck like gravel. "Do you know who she is? What she represents? You didn't just stop someone's mother. You stopped a story. And now it's yours." Granger nodded, wordless. Evans didn't wait for more. "Get her an escort, offer a ride home, and pray she doesn't talk to the press." Kellerman stepped in then, tone dry. "Too late for that. People are already posting about it." Evans's eyes darkened. "Then make it right." Quietly, they turned to where Lucille still sat in the waiting area, her hands resting calmly in her lap, eyes half closed as if resting. She hadn't moved in a while, but the weight of her presence had only grown heavier with time. There was something regal about how still she was, not frozen but unmoved. Like the chaos didn't reach her, or maybe like she'd been through worse and already filed this moment into her archive of unspoken experiences. A junior officer approached her with tentative steps, a set of keys in hand. "Ms. O'Neal, would you like a ride home? The department would be happy to." She opened her eyes and met his gaze without blinking. Then she shook her head once. "Slow." "No," she said. "I'll walk." The response landed like a dropped gavel. Not angry, not confrontational, just final. The young officer looked back at Evans, who gave a single nod. Let her go. Lucille stood, adjusting the strap of her bag. She didn't ask for anything, didn't look around for recognition. She simply turned toward the exit and walked through the front doors without another word. No uniform followed her. No car trailed behind. Just the sound of her shoes tapping against the steps, and then the pavement. Outside, the air had shifted. People were watching. Someone across the street, sitting on a bench, pulled out their phone and began recording. A local reporter from the city's paper, alerted by a Twitter thread, was already parked near the curb. He didn't call to her. He didn't need to. He just took notes as she passed. Lucille didn't look left or right. She walked with the kind of deliberate grace that turned heads without asking for attention. And in that walk was something powerful, a reclamation. She wasn't storming out. She wasn't fleeing. She was leaving on her own terms. After being stopped without cause, doubted, profiled, and held, she now controlled the tone, the energy, the outcome. Inside, Granger stood near the window and watched her go. She never once turned back. Kellerman joined him after a few moments. arms still folded. You think she'll talk? Granger didn't answer, because it didn't matter anymore. She didn't need to. She was the story now. And as Lucille O'Neal disappeared down the street under a soft, late-afternoon sun, the city behind her began to feel different. Not because justice had been served, but because the quiet had been broken. And sometimes all it takes is one walk, one name, one woman to make the system feel its own reflection. The video had already passed 2 million views by the time it reached Shaquille O'Neal's phone. He wasn't scrolling for it. It found him, forwarded from a friend, shared in a group chat, followed by a simple message. Is this your mom? He tapped the screen and let it play. No sound, just shaky footage of a tall older woman with silver hair walking away from a police cruiser. Her steps unhurried, her face unreadable. She didn't speak to the camera. She didn't wave it off. She didn't need to. Shaq paused it. He didn't have to look twice. That was Lucille. He leaned back in his chair, massive fingers folded around the edge of his phone, staring at the frozen image. There was something about her posture, even in that low-resolution frame, that made his chest tighten. She'd carried herself the same way since he was a boy. Not fragile but full of quiet fire. The kind of strength people underestimated until it stood in front of them, and didn't blink. He had that posture now, too. But she'd built it first. He didn't call her. He knew she wouldn't want to talk about it yet. That was her way. Calm first. Process later. Speak only when the moment needed a voice. But he also knew what he had to do. Shaq booked the flight himself. No assistance. No entourage. He didn't announce anything online. He didn't call the media. He packed a small bag, pulled on a gray hoodie, and left quietly. He was in Georgia by morning. The town wasn't big, and he didn't need directions. He knew the roads, had driven them with her once or twice on summer visits. He stopped by a gas station, bought a bottle of water, and listened. Not with his ears, with the way people paused when they recognized him. Some smiled, some whispered, and one cashier, a young woman with wide eyes, lowered her voice and said, "We heard what happened. Everyone did." Shaq just nodded. "Where's the station?" She pointed toward the main road. 2 lights down, brick building. You can't miss it. He could have driven straight there. Stormed through the doors, demanded answers. But that wasn't his way, and it certainly wasn't his mother's. Lucille hadn't raised a man of anger. She'd raised a man of presence. He walked in slowly. The station's lobby went still the moment he stepped through. He didn't wear a suit, didn't wear a badge, but somehow he carried both. A silent authority, a sense of something weighty. Entering the room, Sergeant Kellerman was the first to recognize him. He stood up straighter, didn't speak. Granger, who had just come from the back hallway, froze in place. The receptionist's hand hovered mid-clipboard. The silence was palpable. Shaq approached the desk and placed both palms down, calm and deliberate. "I'm here to talk," he said. Evans came out from his office within seconds. The man looked tired, like he'd spent the entire night doing damage control that didn't stick. He extended a hand. Shaq didn't take it right away. He looked him in the eye. "My mother was here," Shaq said. "You know that, right?" Evans nodded. "Yes, sir, we do. And I assure you." Shaq raised a hand, not aggressive, just enough to stop him. "I'm not here for assurances. I'm here for truth. And not just about her. I want to know how many others." Evans blinked. "Others?" Shaq leaned in slightly. "Yeah. How many people like her, stopped without cause, questioned without record, walked home in silence?" Evans shifted, clearly caught off guard. We're reviewing past reports. We take these matters seriously." "Start taking them personally," Shaq said. "That's when it changes." There was no anger in his voice, no raised tone, but the weight in it made the room feel smaller. His presence didn't demand attention, it commanded accountability. Word had already spread beyond the station. By the time Shaq walked back outside, reporters were parked in unmarked vans. Some held cameras at their hips, others scribbled notes from behind sunglasses. He didn't stop for them. He walked down the block, toward the local community center. Inside, people had gathered, not for him, not yet, but to talk. Quiet conversations turned into something more organized, more deliberate. A school teacher shared her story of being stopped in her own driveway. A mail carrier, uniformed and exhausted, described how he was told to prove he lived on the route he'd worked for 8 years. No one shouted, no one cursed, but the air buzzed with the sound of wounds finally speaking. Shaq didn't interrupt. He stood in the back at first, listening. Really listening. Then, when the moment was right, he stepped forward. I came here because of my mother, he said. But this is bigger than her. This is about every quiet story that didn't go viral. Every name that didn't get looked up. Every person who wasn't famous enough to walk away without a scar. There was no applause. Not because it wasn't powerful, but because the moment wasn't for performance. It was for acknowledgement. The room stood still, soaking it in, and in that stillness, something shifted. Justice didn't roar that day. It didn't arrive with marching or headlines or punishment. It stepped in, slow, massive, and full of intention. Shaq shook hands with the teacher, hugged the mail carrier, sat with a young boy whose mother whispered, "He wants to be tall like you, but safe like her." "I want that too," Shaq told him. And as he left the center, the people didn't follow him with cameras. They watched him with a new kind of reverence. Not for the athlete, but for the man who showed up without fanfare and listened like justice had ears. The chief's office was quiet. Not the kind of quiet that brings peace, but the kind that feels earned after long conversations, years of tension, and decades of things unsaid. Shaquille O'Neal sat in a chair too small for his frame, elbows resting on his knees, his eyes steady, clear. Chief Donnelly sat across from him behind a wide desk that looked more like a wall than furniture, polished, thick, and built to separate authority from everything else. But right now, that desk offered no protection. Shaq didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His words had weight that didn't require volume. "I'm not here to point fingers," he began. "But we can't pretend this is about just one incident. You and I both know my mother isn't the first. She just happened to be the wrong one for the right kind of attention." Chief Donnelly exhaled through his nose. He was a man built for poker faces, but there was a crack in the mask now, faint but spreading. "What happened shouldn't have happened," he admitted. "We're handling it internally." Shaq shook his head slowly. "You're handling the headline. But what about the history?" There was silence. So he continued. "You ever grow up watching your mother hide her tears because she couldn't get a bank to trust her with a loan? You ever watch her stand at the back of a PTA meeting while people whispered about her tone when she spoke up about her kid? You ever see her clench her jaw when a store clerk followed her through 3 aisles, but smiled when the white woman behind her showed up?" Shaq paused, but not because he was unsure. He paused because he wanted it to land. "My mom raised 4 kids alone. She worked 2 jobs. She held the house together with duct tape and prayer, and she taught us to respect the law, even when the law didn't respect her. That's who you stopped last week. That's who your officers looked in the face and decided wasn't safe to walk to the post office." Donnelly sat back, hands folded. "This isn't how the department wants to be seen." Shaq leaned forward now, voice still low. "Then start seeing differently." Across town, things were already shifting. The community center was now a place of momentum, not just memory. Word had spread about Lucille's incident, and not just because of her last name. It was the way she had walked away. Poised, silent, undeniable, that lit the fuse. In the days that followed, people who had been silent for years began to speak. A high school custodian told of being pulled over 5 times in 3 months on the same road home. A retired librarian shared how her teenage grandson had been frisked outside his own apartment complex for looking nervous. A minister recalled the time 2 officers asked him to unlock the church after hours because they didn't believe he had a key. They weren't loud stories. They weren't violent ones. But they carried something sharper. The exhaustion of being judged before speaking. Searched before seen. At the station, things began to fracture. A young officer named Millen, who'd only been on the force for 8 months, submitted a request to be transferred. "I didn't sign up for this," he told his supervisor. "I signed up to protect, not profile." Sergeant Kellerman, too, found himself looking in the mirror longer before putting on the uniform. He'd seen it happen, watched it unfold. He hadn't stopped it. That realization clung to him. Even Granger, once stiff and certain, had started asking questions he didn't like the answers to. In the locker room, surrounded by the buzz of chatter, he heard his name mentioned under breath. Not as a hero, as a warning, and for the first time in his short career, he felt the discomfort of being known for something that couldn't be defended. Meanwhile, Shaq kept the spotlight where it belonged, not on his status, but on the pattern. He visited schools, not as a celebrity, but as a son. "Your title doesn't protect your mother," he told one group of students. "Only your actions can do that." He sat with elders who'd been quiet for years, listening to the same story in different voices. Wrongful stops, casual cruelty, the slow erosion of dignity at the hands of badges worn by men who never saw them as equals. And through it all, Lucille never spoke to the press. Her silence remained powerful, not because she had nothing to say, but because she had already said everything she needed to by simply standing tall, waiting and walking. In the chief's office, Shaq rose to his full height. He didn't need to slam a fist. He didn't need to make threats. He just looked Donnelly in the eye and said, "Change doesn't start when people are angry. It starts when they stop being afraid to say the truth out loud. That's happening now. You can either lead it or get left behind." Donnelly didn't respond right away. But he didn't look away either. And sometimes that's the beginning of something real. Outside, the sun had started to lower. The shadows were longer now. But so were the voices. And beneath the badge, something deeper was being revealed. Not just flaws in a system, but cracks in a silence that had gone on too long. It wasn't a protest. There were no slogans being shouted, no list of demands being chanted in rhythm. This was something quieter, a reckoning without a riot, a moment carved out of collective breath. Someone had brought water bottles. Someone else passed out fans made from folded programs, the ones with Lucille's name printed in soft, elegant type beneath the title, "Community Gathering for Dignity, for Change." Shaquille O'Neal stood near the back, hands folded, watching as people filled the space. He hadn't brought cameras. He hadn't planned a speech. He had only agreed to come if it stayed what it was, not about him, but about the one that started with his mother, but stretched wider than her shoulders could carry alone. Lucille wasn't there. She'd declined the invitation gently, telling him, "They don't need to see me again. They need to see each other." He had understood. At exactly 4 o'clock, a woman from the local school board stepped onto the platform. She didn't introduce Shaq. She didn't even mention Lucille by name. She simply said, "We're here today because something happened." And it told us everything we already knew but were too tired to keep repeating. But we're not tired anymore. We're awake. Shaq stepped forward a few minutes later, not summoned, just moved. The microphone was adjusted again. Even the kids in the back, the ones who had been tugging on juice boxes and squirming in their seats, looked up. "I want to tell you about a woman," Shaq began, his voice low but carried by the speakers. "Not because she raised me, not because she's strong, not because she's famous now, by accident, but because of what she didn't do." A hush fell over the crowd. He let the silence sit for a moment. She didn't shout. She didn't threaten. She didn't call in favors. She just stood still, and that stillness made more noise than anything else I've seen in my life. He paused. "My mother's whole life, she's had to convince people she belonged in banks, in schools, in stores, and now at 70-something, she's still convincing, still proving, still being stopped for walking while black on a sunny day in her own town." People nodded, not because they were shocked, but because they weren't. Shaq continued. "Slower now. This ain't about bad cops. This ain't about one station. This is about what happens when silence becomes policy, when suspicion becomes habit, when people stop seeing each other as neighbors and start seeing them as warnings." In the third row, Officer Granger stood, not in uniform, not behind a barrier. He had come in plain clothes, late, choosing the edge of the crowd instead of the front. When Shaq started speaking, he had removed his ball cap, his hands tucked awkwardly into his jacket pockets, the posture of a man unsure if he belonged. He didn't hide, but he didn't step forward either. He simply listened. Shaq's voice softened now. "I don't want my kids to grow up learning how to shrink themselves to feel safe. I don't want your kids to think quiet means weak. I want them to know there's power in dignity, and there's more power in showing up without rage, but with purpose." The crowd didn't cheer. It breathed. There was something sacred in that moment. Not because it was polished or perfect, but because it was true. The truth didn't need a megaphone. It needed witnesses. And the city showed up. Some with memories, some with guilt, some with hope that something, finally, might start to shift. In the far corner of the field, a retired judge sat beside a grocery store cashier. Across the aisle, a teenager in a hoodie nodded along beside an elderly man in a veteran's cap. There were no divides that day, just shared space. And under the weight of it all, no one flinched when the next name was called to the mic. It was the mother of a local firefighter, a woman named Mrs. Dorsey. She stepped up, voice shaky, hands slightly trembling. "My son," she said, "was stopped twice last year walking home. In uniform. Both times he showed his badge. Both times it wasn't enough. I didn't come here to complain. I came to say I see you. Lucille, all of you. And I'm ready to speak up now." Granger didn't move, but his shoulders sank. The words were sticking. He didn't ask for forgiveness that day. No one offered him a chance to. That wasn't what this was about. This was about truth being told in the open, not for revenge, but for release. As the gathering drew to a close, people didn't rush to leave. They lingered, shook hands, shared stories. A city that once walked past each other in grocery aisles, now looked each other in the eyes, and before they left, something remarkable happened. Someone knelt. A young girl, maybe 10, maybe 11, knelt in front of the stage, not in shame, not in grief, but in silent honor. Others followed. Dozens. Then more. The whole crowd, at once, dropping slowly to their knees. Not forced, not led, but moved. And no one said a word. They just knelt. Not to apologize, but to recognize the truth of what they'd allowed, what they'd ignored, and what they were now ready to change. A city had fallen to its knees, not in defeat, but in rebirth. The house was quiet again. The kind of quiet that came not from absence but from peace. Afternoon sunlight filtered through sheer curtains, washing the living room in a soft golden hue. The air smelled faintly of lemon polish and warm fabric. Lived-in comfort. Lucille O'Neal sat in her favorite armchair near the front window, the same spot where she had read books to her children, watched neighborhood kids chase basketballs down the street, and sometimes simply sat still, listening to time pass like wind through leaves. A thick scrapbook rested open on her lap, its pages worn smooth from years of turning. The first few were filled with clippings, headlines, magazine spreads, glossy photos of Shaquille in his Lakers jersey, on talk shows, holding trophies the size of toddlers. She smiled at them, warm and proud, but she didn't linger. She'd seen those pages 100 times. Instead, she flipped past them. Past the championship rings and the Hollywood cameos. Past the celebrity galas and honorary doctorates. She turned to the older pages, the faded ones, curling at the edges. A grainy black and white photo caught her eye. She stopped. It showed a younger version of herself, sitting on a narrow twin bed in a Newark apartment, arms wrapped around a baby, wrapped in a hospital blanket. His face was barely visible, his fists curled, head tucked against her collarbone. She remembered that day like it had just happened. No money, no father in the picture. Just her, that child, and a heart full of both fear and resolve. She had looked down at that baby, not knowing what the world would make of him, only knowing she'd do whatever it took to protect his light. She traced a finger lightly across the page. There had been no crowd that day, no photographers, no one writing headlines, but it was, in every way, the beginning of something historic. On the shelf nearby was a small stack of letters she'd received since the incident, notes from strangers. Some handwritten, some typed, all heartfelt. A teacher in Colorado, a retired nurse from Memphis, a high school student who had read about her online and wanted to say thank you for being calm when you didn't have to be. Lucille hadn't responded to them all, but she'd read every single one, and she knew something had shifted. Not just in the city, not just in her son's eyes when he came to visit the next day and hugged her longer than usual, but in herself. For decades, Lucille had moved through life choosing quiet over confrontation. Not because she was afraid, but because she knew the cost of speaking too loudly, too soon, too often. She had learned the power of composure, the defiance and dignity. She had walked away from that police stop, not to make a statement, but to remind herself she could. But what came after? That wasn't her doing. That was the world finally realizing what had always been true. "They didn't see me," the narrator said, "until they saw who she raised. But the truth, she'd always been enough. Long before the courtside seats, before the foundation grants, before the honorary degrees, Lucille O'Neal had stood tall, in grocery store aisles when cashiers second-guessed her coupons, in waiting rooms when her voice was talked over, in neighborhoods where she was watched instead of welcomed, and still she carried herself like royalty, without crown or audience. Now, sitting in her chair, the scrapbook on her lap, Lucille smiled again, this time softer. Not at the pages, but at the space between them, at the memories that weren't captured by cameras. Her youngest son's first Christmas, when the heat had gone out, the nights she patched jeans by lamplight, her hands sore from work, the Sunday morning she walked to church in heels that pinched, her children in their pressed shirts beside her.
That was the story.
And now the world had finally caught up to it. Outside, the same sun that once cast suspicion now stretched across her front porch like a welcome mat. The world hadn't changed overnight, but something had, a small fracture in the way things had always been. The beginning of a reframe, where identity wasn't tied to fame and worth wasn't measured in headlines. Lucille closed the scrapbook and stood, her movements slow but deliberate. She walked toward the kitchen, where the kettle had just begun to whistle. She didn't rush. She didn't need to. She moved like someone who had nothing left to prove. And that was the quiet truth of it all. She never needed her son's name to matter. She never needed the badge to recognize her. She never needed to explain why she walked proud. Because the world had finally said it. But Lucille had always known. She was more than a name. She was the reason it meant something in the first place. If this story made you pause, don't let it end here. Share it in rooms where silence feels safer than truth. Look again at the people you pass every day, and ask what stories they've had to carry quietly. Change doesn't come from shouting louder. It comes from listening longer. Start there, and keep walking.